Razaq-Shuaib. I'm a PhD candidate here at the Faculty of Education, University of Cambridge, and today I will be sharing my reflections from my fieldwork on the methodological approaches to understanding the voices of children with neurodevelopmental disorders in a Nigerian context. My PhD is currently being supervised by Professor Nidi Senior. So I'll start with a big problem that this research is trying to solve. So globally, children with disabilities face exclusion. That is something that we know out there, and this is a big problem across countries. And what has been done so far? We know that this problem exists. What has been done so far? There have been international treaties and conventions, such as the Convention on the Rights of the Child, as well as the UNCRPD Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This is some of the conventions to entrench the rights of people as well as children who have disabilities. There's also been the Salamanca Statement and Framework for Special Needs. So these are all treaties that have been put in place internationally to ensure that across countries, children with disabilities, and in fact, persons with disabilities, have their rights respected and entrenched. In Nigeria, we are a party to many of these conventions. We have ratified the conventions that I have listed there. And in fact, there is a legal framework in place for ensuring that children and persons with disabilities have access to every other thing that other people have access to as well. However, despite all of these efforts that have been put in place, children with disabilities still are not accessing education. So what do we know? What does the literature tell us? Number one, there has been emphasis on policy gaps. So up until 2019, there was no law, there was no act in Nigeria to protect the rights of persons with disabilities outside of what is primarily in the Constitution. So a lot of the literature goes into, there should be a law in place protecting the rights of persons with disabilities. There's still a lot of stigmatization around understanding and awareness of disabilities. Then resource constraints, teacher training, and all of these issues that you would typically find in many other contexts apart from Nigeria. However, there was something that we really could not find in the literature, and that was documented experiences of parents and children with disabilities. So we understand teachers are unable to act. There are no policies, there's no this, there's no that. But what about the children themselves? What about their parents? What do we know about that? And there wasn't really anything. And in instances where we found research that had been done, they were more focused on children who had sensory impairment. So maybe children who have visual impairment or other forms of impairment, other than children who have neurodevelopmental disorders. And that says something about also the way neurodevelopmental disorders are seen in that concept. And therefore, this study was to understand the policy provisions in place for the primary education of children with neurodevelopmental disorders, as well as parents and children's experiences of accessing education. And so what is the methodological approach to this work? First, I need to say that this work is grounded in sort of Southern theory. So, and the reason for that is we as a group, CaNDER, as well as the work that I do under the supervision of Professor Singal, has a lot of focus on social justice. And so this was, how do we listen in a way that is context sensitive? So not just listening for listening for being sensitive about what we listen to. And so my methodological approach is grounded in Southern theory. And I'm using a two-pronged approach. On one hand, I'm looking at the policies. So I'm looking at 6 disability and education policies And on the other hand, so in those policies, I want to understand how the roles and how the roles of parents are constructed, how the voices are represented. I want to see the other things that are going on in those policies. And then that would create, a contextual background to do the case study, to understand how parents see themselves. When you want to understand their lived experiences and their perceptions, how do they see themselves versus how are they constructed within the policies? So the case study involves 12 parents using semi-structured interviews and 7 children within the ages of 6 to 13 years. This is the primary school age in Nigeria. It is 6 to 12 years, but 13 years because sometimes you have children just go a bit over the recommended age. And for the children, I used multi-participatory adapted mosaic framework, which I'll talk about later. The location was Lagos. And I need to emphasize here that this study, at the point of design, there was the question of whether or not I was going to involve children in the design. But the thing is that there really wasn't anything that had been done with children in this capacity using any of these approaches. So it was again important that we don't leave this out, because if we, worry about how is it going to be done and all of that, then that means that the student will continue to be excluded. So this is the first study within disability and education literature in that context to actually attempt to listen to the voices of children with neurodevelopmental disorders and using this approach. And so for this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on the children's aspect. So what was the overarching research question for the children's part? I wanted to understand what are different stakeholders' perceptions and experiences of educating their children with disabilities. And for the children's part, I wanted to know, how do children with neurodevelopmental disorder, how do they experience education? And so the children in the study, I already mentioned in the previous slide, there were 7 children. They have diagnoses for autism spectrum disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. In some cases, children had both. How did I select the children? Because again, this was one of the things that came up. How did I select the children? Who should we include? Who should we not include? All parents were allowed to opt in their children, having first agency for their children. So all the parents were allowed to opt in. But I made it clear at the start of the research that all the children were equally going to have a chance to say whether they wanted to be a part of it or not. And even when the parents had said it was okay for a child to participate, if a child was not willing to participate, then it was fine for the child not to participate. And later on in the presentation, I'll talk about the ethics. So in essence, there were 12 families, but only 7 children ended up participating in the study. And what was the framework that I used? So I speak of the multi-participatory adapted mosaic framework. This mosaic framework was first done by Clark and Moss, and in their own case, they used talking and verbal interviewing, as well as touring, to understand how children were experiencing how their experience of life. And the reason I chose mosaic framework for this was a number of things. Number one is it is flexible. And so it allows you to use more than one approach to do the work. And number two is it foregrounds the co-creation of knowledge with children. And this was central to, the work that I was trying to do. Remember, I said that the work is grounded in Southern theory. And so it was important that we weren't talking for children. I wasn't just listening to parents' voices for children. I wanted to actually hear what the children had to say for themselves. So, and then another thing was, when I was going into, this phase of the work, I was worried. This was by far the scariest part of my PhD. Not even, coding the data can come close to this, because of my limited experience working with children who have disabilities. And so the question was, are you going to work with children who have speech, or are you going to work with children who don't have speech? If I chose to work with children who have speech, then, you know, though it may have been justified, I would have excluded another group of children. And so I said, you know what, I'll leave this open. But I recognize that I may encounter some barriers, like the level of speech that a child has may impact the study in different ways. And so I would adapt to what the speech level was for each child. And so having that at the back of my mind, this came in very handy because I wanted, you know, something that would allow me to be able to adapt to every child's needs. And finally, it was also the cognitive abilities of the children. There has been research that shows that the cognitive abilities can change for children, can vary for children, you know, considering their chronological age versus the cognitive age. So these were some of the things. But in understanding what children were going to say, it was also important to understand, to conceptualize what I was listening to. So it wasn't just voice, it was voice and silences. And the work of Professor Laura Lundy came in really handy in conceptualizing both voice and silence. This were some of the things. And so what you have here is like the toolbox that I had. I remember when I was going, you know, it was, what is going to be in this toolbox? And I said I was just going to use art, whatever it was. But at the end of the day, I was able to settle for this, this tool. So I had research diary, I had picture books, verbal interviews, and I had interactive approaches. I mean, I would love this. I didn't say it was the scariest, but it was one of the most interesting experiences that I had. This was the average time I spent with each child, and some of the interviews happened at home, some happened at the school setting, because we ended up moving setting to meet the needs of the child. And so for this presentation, I will focus on one of those methods that you found in the toolbox, and that is the picture book as a method. This is one that, you know, you may not come across often in books. And so what is this method? It involves using picture books, you know, to gain insight into the lives of children. And it has been used for children in the preverbal stage, so below 5 years, children with disabilities in the preverbal stage, below 5 years. And why would I choose that if I was working with children who were 6 to 13? Remember, I said that for some children who have neurodevelopmental disorders, their cognitive abilities sometimes can be below their chronological age. So this was one of the things I was hoping to leverage, as well as the fact that I know picture books are fun, and, you know, it could even just be a way to have access to the child, just have something to read about. And so what was the key process that using picture book entails? Number one, before the activity itself, is that you need to assess what has the child done before you introduce this activity to them, and how is the child feeling? Then the next thing is, once you've assessed and that looks okay, you can then present the child with the books. In this case, 3 books at first, and then the books are not presented in the same order every day. You present them with maybe like 3 books, and then allow them to pick. And then once you've seen what their preferences are, you present them with the same set of books and see how they react to that. But usually no more than 3 books. And again, this has a reason. You don't want the child to be overwhelmed. For some other children, maybe who don't have neurodevelopmental disorders, it's possible that, you know, you have an array of things that you say, oh, pick, and then they're running up and down and trying to pick. For these other children, confusion can be a problem, and we want to avoid that. And then the last part, which is so important, I mean, each step fits into the other one, but this is the part, this is where you need to observe and engage with what is going on with the child. And so these are the books that I used. I used 3 books, Choices, Bathroom Boogie, and Dragons Can Sing. Well, one of the books is my book. And how did I pick this book? So these were books that I already had at home. I didn't have to buy these books for this purpose. But how did I know that these books were going to be useful? Because I understood what it was that I wanted to learn from the children. And also I have 2 children below the age of 10. So again, this was kind of like a familiar terrain as a mom in terms of like what books. And so I looked at the content of those books and I saw that they had things that would actually help the research questions that I have. And so that was, so you can say maybe in a way they were biased because there probably are other books that might be able to do the same work, but these were the ones that I used. And again, I have the base of selection here. I'm mindful of time and I have how the books were used here, but I'm going to show you something. And this is like a proper example. So let's take child X. This is one of the children in the study. Child X doesn't really use speech. So child X didn't have a lot of speech. And so this is day 4. So I got this from my diary notes. Now, let me tell you something about the use of that adapted framework. Remember, in the previous slide, I said it allows you to use more than one approach. It is so critical when you're working with children to be able to use more than one method to gather the data that you want, to understand what the child is saying, to triangulate, to understand that what you think you have heard or what you think the child is telling you is exactly what the child is telling you. And so I have diary notes, I have videos, I have all these other things that I collected. But so this I was able to pull out from like the diary notes. So on this particular day, I get there. The child was about to have a trampoline jump. So the child was already used to my face at this point. So we get there, we do the trampoline jump together. After the jump, the child had fruit snacks according to his timetable. So first thing I am thinking at that time is, he's just finished jumping. There are 2 things that can happen. He might be tired, and so that might affect the next thing I want to present to him, or he might, be ready to go. So that is assessing the situation. And again, this is not the same for every child. The process, yes, assess, present, and observe and engage, yes, but how that would look for every child, totally different. So this is day 4 of that child. Day 3 of this child would totally be different from this. And so that again is the thing about using it, not always the same way, but the background, the approach is always the same. And so I present the child. Before he got into the room, the books were already laid on the table. So I presume he got there, he saw the books. At this point, I am looking at what is the child interested in? Is he interested in this activity? And if he is not interested in this activity, then I can present him with another activity. In this slide, I said that no strict format. This is so important that you don't, say, this is the only format I am going to use to present activities to the child. If you want to do A, the child doesn't want to do A, you remove that and do B. In fact, if the child doesn't want to do anything, you just sit down and play the entire thing. So, so again, I present the child with the book, see his answers. Should we do this? Now, should we work for books? Again, using language that the child is familiar with. I can say, are we reading today? Perhaps the child wouldn't get it, but work for something is a language that is already in use with the child. So when there's an activity to be done, we're working for reinforcement. And so should we work for this so that you can get that? And so timing appeared to be right, everything appeared to be good. And then this is the really interesting part, observe and engage. How many books do we have? 3. Now, I know because I've engaged with the child's learning plan. I know that counting is one of the things that they're trying to achieve. And so I think, all right, how many books do we have? We have 3 books. Let's count 1, 2, 3. Also, making sure that my work or whatever it is I'm doing with the child ties back into the bigger goals for the child. So my whatever it is I'm doing is not taking the child off course. And then, which book would you like to read? So again, giving the child a chance to choose. This is them choosing. This is me choosing. They could as well just push all the books aside and it will be fine. I mean, yeah, maybe not fine for timing, but then it would still be fine. And then what is this? And so this was some of the things Now, you see, these 3 steps are so important, making sure that the child can identify, interpret, and understand instructions, because I'm still going to use another tool with the child. And I want to establish through this activity that when I get to that other tool, the child would understand instructions. I mean, yeah, the instructions might vary, but again, I'm assessing what is the child's cognitive ability in terms of, following instructions and some of these things. And the key insights from this activity here is you need to be fully present, because they give you, children leave cues in everything. And so you need to be discerning and be able to pick up those cues quickly. And more importantly, you need to embed yourself in the process. I cannot overemphasize that. So these are the images of the book, how the child engaged with the book. So in this particular child's case, child's reaction to certain things like toothbrushing. At the time I interviewed the child's mom, the mom had told me that toothbrushing was a thing, like this is an activity the child struggles with. The child doesn't like this activity. And so once we got to bathroom boogie and we got to the page that had toothbrushing, the child pushed the book away and said, no, I don't want to do this. Immediately, I connected that with what the mom had told me, like, oh, you really don't like doing this. And then I asked her, you don't like toothbrushing, let's move the page. And then we moved the page and the child continued to engage. So again, you see, I have that particular data collected from one source, another source, and it is still data that I'm going to check again when I use another tool. And this was a different one. So the child here, thinks he had speech, but this was, how did you do this? Perhaps I can do this too. Maybe this is what I would like to do when I grow up. So it was a different way. The child who engaged most with this didn't really engage with this book. And again, you'll see how different books work for different children. So that was picture book. And there were other tools that I used as well. I used talking mat. With the talking mat, it is an augmentative communication tool, but in this instance, you're using graphic symbols to communicate with the child. And so the symbols I used were from widgets. So you would notice as part of the tool, I said I used a talking mat. The symbols were created using widgets. And for this, I had to adapt again. For instance, when we got to food, if you go to widget will present you with like other images of food. And for me, I wanted things that the child could relate to. What is the food that the child eats? Widget does allow you to import your own images. So we had plantain and egg, and again, I had this information from previous conversation with the child's mom. What does the child like and all of that. So sort of like building on some of the information that I had before when I was presenting the child with it. Of course, as soon as the child identified the food that they wanted, they could easily pick that out. These are the things I like and these are the things that I don't like. So this is helpful, when a child doesn't use a lot of speech as well. And my participants, I had 7. One child used no speech at all. 2 children were able to use speech well. And then the other 1, 2, 3, 4 children had, varying degrees of speech. And then this is another beautiful, beautiful, beautiful one that I didn't even know I could use. And this is other interactive activities. This is just one of the other interactive activities, and that was chess. So this particular child loves playing chess. Up until this point, I didn't know how to play chess. And so we bring out the chessboard, show me how to play chess. And this was so useful because the moment I lost, something happened. The child felt like, oh, I can let you win. And I said, it's fine to lose. Do you ever feel like this too? And then the child goes, yeah, maybe. And then starts talking about their experience. Did it happen in school? Did it happen at home? So this is how, just engaging with the activities that the child actually enjoys helps you to gain insight into the child's words. And some of the ethical concerns that I had, I stated when I started this presentation, will I hear their voices? I mean, this was a big, big, big concern for me. Will I hear their voices? Will I hear it correctly? And will I understand? And these were the things that kept me reflecting all through the process. What am I hearing? In the case of the child who didn't use speech, for instance, if I follow his body language, what am I picking? How do I know that what I'm picking is the right thing to pick? How do I check that that is what the child is trying to tell me? So these were the things that, I kept reflecting on through the process. The second thing was gaining consent. What does initial and ongoing, assent look like for the child? There was a child in the study who, on the first day, didn't want to talk to me. It just didn't want to talk to me. It could have been that the child was tired. It could have been that they didn't want to be with strangers. Now, if you kind of listen to or just follow the literature the way it is, it might be like, once the child says no, no means no. But just like adults, we need to remember that sometimes no isn't a blanket no. So for every time I met the child, I presented myself. You have a right to say no every single time that you meet me. And so that is it, the fact that a child can say yes today and say no tomorrow, but they can say yes again the day after. It isn't blanket, like the moment they say no, that is the end for the study. Confidentiality, who is listening? The children kept asking me, so what are you going to do with this recording? Because they knew that I was recording. For some of the children who could use speech, are you going to put it somewhere? Are you going to? And I had to keep reassuring them, like, no, not even mommy will listen to this. Nobody else will listen to this. I just need to record this so that I can remember it later. Otherwise, I may not remember. So it gave a chance to reassure the children that they were safe. And then well-being, there are times, so there were 12 parents, but there were 7 children. And some of the reasons why we didn't have more children had to do with like the child's well-being. You go to the child is ill. How much help would this research do for this child? But there are no easy answers to any of these questions that I have raised. The key thing is we need to just keep reflecting on what would work best for the child. Right. This has decided to not click. Yes, what worked? These were the things that I consider enablers. I was willing to try. And my experience as a mom, and me, over and above everything else, I think that was key. I thought about the way I engage with my children. Of course, this is not to say that other people who don't have children can't engage with children, no. But in my case, this worked for me more than everything else. And then I said I have limited experience working with children with neurodevelopmental disorders, but even at that, the limited experience did help. But if I didn't have that, I think my experience as a mom really, really helped. And pre-information from caregivers, I told you how I leveraged, the information from the parents and the knowledge of the context. So again, there are people who would go into a context as outsiders. And so it is so important that you understand how things work in that context. This was something that worked in my favor. Limitations of the study is, first I'll talk about location. Now you see Nigeria is a multicultural place. And so that means that a study that is done in Lagos, in one part of Lagos, does not necessarily represent the entire Lagos or in fact the entire Nigeria. So across cultures, reaction, all of these things could be different. And then the size is also a small study. I mean, understandably, it is in-depth. It was small for a reason, so we can go in-depth with the children. But what that says to us is, even though the aim is not to generalize, we need to do more of this listening because there's so much that can be learned. And so what are some of the lessons that I learned? Children with neurodevelopmental disorders have a voice. I remember talking to the parents, particularly the children who don't really use speech, and they were hesitant when I said, I'm going to work with the children. They were like, the child doesn't use speech. What are you going to do? For them, engaging with children was synonymous with speech. And there's literature around the fact that even times, I mean, when I was doing the pilot study as well, it was something that I confirmed, that there are times that parents themselves feel confused when their children don't use speech, like they think, are they hearing right? So, when I say, am I going to hear right? That is a valid question because even the moms feel, am I hearing these children right? And then another lesson, it is a complex process. there's nothing I have said here today that should underplay how complex this process is. And we should never think, listening to children's voices is something that can be done just with children. In our context, it doesn't happen like that. They are gatekeepers and their roles are important. So we need to, take them along and work together with them. Flexibility is important. Be ready to pivot. You want to do this today, you just sit out. And then lack of interest may be temporary. I already spoke about that. And what are the implications for policy practice and future research? Now, this child's right, this is one international treaty that talks about listening to children's voices, in fact, enacting the value of the child's voice. But this provision, this Article 12, is problematic. And for some of the reasons that I have mentioned here. What is voice? How do we listen? How do we take into consideration the other things that are going on in the context? So these are things that we're now engaging with. As a result of this research, I had to change some of the questions like, how do you actually listen to these children's voices? Because we keep saying, listen, listen, listen. How do you know you're listening? How do you know? It says when the child can give their voice, when they are known to be. How do you know that is the time is right? Listening to children's voices cannot be dissected and should not be dissected from listening to parents' voices. It should be taken together. And then there needs to be critical re-engagement with the process of setting these agendas. Again, this Article 12 is an example. What level of engagement was done in the Global South, in order to come up with provisions like that? And lastly, findings, which we will share in the future from this particular one, because there were some really insightful things there were a lot of insightful things that came out from this particular part of the study, but it helps us understand what works for children. We are keen to work with children. We're keen to do what works best for children. And one of the important ways to learn that is to work with children, listen to their voices, so that, when trying to put things, policies and practices in place for them, we know that we're capturing their voices. And that is the end. Thank you for listening.